Alright, very cool. This will be my commentary over the article by Vincent W. Wu. Hey guys, I read the article by Vincent W. Wu, the Reverend Vincent W. Wu, and he made a very compelling point. It kind of connects with the previous article that I spoke about, which was much more opinionated and less structured, as you'll see here on the screen. But he writes about the celebration of daily Mass with no faithful present after Vatican II. Alright, let me read the abstract that he has. In many large gatherings of priests, seminaries, and formation houses, daily concelebration among priests has become the default option in recent decades. A canonical question arises. Can a priest who has daily access to a concelebrated Mass legitimately choose to celebrate alone due to his own devotion to the Eucharist? Contrary to the prevalent misconception that Vatican II aimed at eliminating private Mass through the promotion of concelebration, Canon 904 encourages priests to offer daily Masses even when the faithful cannot be present. Canon 906 allows priests to celebrate Mass alone for a just and reasonable cause. Canon 902 stipulates that a priest has the complete freedom to offer Mass individually. This article shows that it is licit for a priest to celebrate alone, even if there is a concelebration available, as long as the concelebration does not take place simultaneously in the same church or oratory. A Mass celebrated even without the participation of the faithful remains the center of the entire church and the heart of priestly existence. The canonical right of a priest to celebrate alone, based on Vatican II's teachings on daily Mass and the life of a priest, must be safeguarded. Apologies, just moving the computer closer. So in his introduction, he goes over the guidelines. And he says, well, here's my summary of everything. Does a priest have to concelebrate when he cannot find any faithful to attend his individual Mass? The article is to counter John Hewell's assertion that a priest cannot celebrate alone, as personal preference does not meet the reasonable cause necessary for Canon 906. Alright, so these two sentences don't seem to correlate too well to each other, but the first one is just almost like a summary of the abstract. And the second is Reverend Vincent Wu's whole preference of writing the article. He is countering John Hewell's assertion of what is a reasonable cause. And once that reasonable cause is defined, it kind of orders where the person lies and what they will do according to 906, 904, and 902 canon. So let me read those canons to you. Canon 902 states, unless the welfare of the Christian faithful requires or suggests otherwise, priests can concelebrate the Eucharist. They are completely free to celebrate the Eucharist individually, however, but not while a concelebration is taking place in the same church or oratory. Canon 904 states, remembering always that in the mystery of the Eucharist sacrifice, the work of redemption is exercised continually. Priests are to celebrate frequently. Indeed, daily celebration is recommended earnestly since, even if the faithful cannot be present, it is the act of Christ and the Church in which priests fulfill their principal function. And then Canon 906 states, except for a just and reasonable cause, a priest is not to celebrate the Eucharist sacrifice without the participation of at least some member of the faithful. And there you can see the idea of what is a reasonable and just cause. So the Reverend Vincent Wu disagrees with John Hewell's assessment of what a just and reasonable cause is. And later you'll see my take on which one I agree with. So there's a few breaks in this article from the Jurist that the Reverend Vincent W writes. Firstly, he goes over the historical legislation before the 917 Code of Canon Law. And these definitions of 902, 904, and 906 were taken from the 1983 Code of Canon Law. So, the historical legislation before 1917. The history of the Mass is that it has been celebrated in common. The Synod of Laodicea in 363 declared, "It is not proper to bring about the oblations in houses by bishops or presbyters." The Councils of Trullo in 692 says, we decree that clerics who in oratories within houses make these sacred or baptized must do this with the judgment of that place's bishop. Hence, if any cleric would not observe this in such a way, he is to be deposed. The Church sought to regulate the private celebration of the Mass very early on. The private Mass stems from monastic communities and specific votive Masses for the faithful. Rev Vincent W writes that the Church considered the development of purely private Masses as an abuse. The bishops wrote that the Mass is not an individual endeavor. It requires a priest and those faithful to respond. The Synod of Paris in 829 wrote, "It creeps into many places that several of the presbyters also celebrate the ceremonies of the Masses without servers, that from now on the practice of this sort is to be restrained." End quote. The bishops recognized the abuse that a priest caused when he celebrated Mass without a server, and in the 12th century, Pope Alexander III enacted a law that states, quote, "For no presbyter can celebrate the ceremonies of the Masses alone or other divine offices without the assistance of a server." End quote. The Council of Trent likewise promulgated the requirement for a server at any Mass. So this is his historical layout of what was going on before the 1917 Code of Canon Law. And you can kind of see the idea that the Church doesn't promote this private celebration of the Mass, but through monastic houses and specific ceremonies, it kind of developed naturally, you would say. But even though it developed naturally, the Church doesn't seem to enjoy or want to promote this. He continues with the development and the Canon 813, Section 1 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, and the Pope's Quam Plurimum. Canon 813, Section 1 states, "A priest should not celebrate Mass without a minister who assists him and responds." End quote. This canon is a grave obligation for every priest. Mission territories were granted an indult that removed the necessity for a priest to say Mass with a server. The server could be a female under certain circumstances. Special cases allowed the priest to celebrate Mass without a server, i.e., viaticum, or the server leaving during Mass. The Apostolic See issued Quam Plurimum, which justified these specific cases in which a server was not necessary. This document began the debate about whether a server was necessary at all for Mass. First, these scholars began to say that Quam Plurimum was not an exhausted list. The scholars took the case of epidemic to mean that in an inconvenient time a priest is not required to have a server. These scholars asserted that the devotion to daily Mass was greater than the need for a server at every celebrated Mass. This daily Mass turned the celebration of the Mass into a private devotion which had no need of a server, since it would be inconvenient to get one. And here, under this headline, this subtitle, we see the Reverend Wu's idea of what it is to be a reasonable and just cause. So there's a development from the start of the Council of Trent to right before the Second Vatican Council, where this idea of what does a Mass really need a server, and the devotion to a daily Mass, what does this really grant for a priest? This daily devotion, is it a reasonable and just cause? Alright, he continues under the headline Vatican II and the 1983 Code of Canon Law. All this was occurring just before the Second Vatican Council. The Council granted priests a greater flexibility to celebrate Mass without the faithful present for a just and a reasonable cause. Sacrosanctum Concilium taught, quote, it must be emphasized that rites which are meant to be celebrated in common with the faithful present and actively participating should, as far as possible, be celebrated in that way rather than by an individual and quasi-privately, end quote. This is a very interesting point, because taking this directly from Sacrosanctum Concilium, it seems as though this quasi-private celebration of Mass should not be promoted, and therefore it supports John Whewell's argument. But you'll see as we develop farther on that the use of canons 902, 904, and 906 really emphasize this argument that the Reverend Wu presents. So let me continue. Mysterium Fidei 32 and Canon 904. The Council pushed this communal celebration of the Mass, but also pushed for priests to celebrate daily. Pope Paul VI said, every Mass is not something private, even if a priest celebrates it privately, end quote. Rev Vincent W says that Paul VI had a balanced view of the social nature of the Mass and its infinite value when none were present. This is clearly different than the Church of early times. It is a development of how the Mass is viewed, understood, and taught by the Church. Paul VI's teaching from Mysterium Fidei became codified in Canon 904 of the 1983 Code of Canon Law. While I really appreciate the way the Reverend is going through this article and presenting the argument, I just find it so abhorrent. I find it so bad to really take this communal celebration, this social event of the Mass, and make it a personal devotion that promotes a quasi-private celebration. I don't like it, but I see that the Church has gone this way, and I see that its canons allow for this to take place. Alright, so let me continue with my summary of his article. This emphasis on daily Mass, while I'm reading this from his next headline, Presbyterorum Ordinis 13, in Canon 276, Section 2, Part 2. This emphasis on daily Mass is furthered in Presbyterorum Ordinis 13, quote, in the mystery of the Eucharistic sacrifice, in which priests fulfill their principal function, the work of our redemption is continually carried out. For this reason, the daily celebration of it is earnestly recommended. This celebration is an act of Christ and the Church, even if it is impossible for the faithful to be present, end quote. Now, rather than being a devotion for a priest to offer Mass daily, it is their priestly function. Canon 276, Section 2, Part 2 goes farther, quote, brackets, clerics, unbrackets, are to nourish their spiritual life from the twofold table of sacred Scripture and the Eucharist. Therefore, priests are earnestly invited to offer the Eucharistic sacrifice daily, and deacons to participate in its offering daily, end quote. This understanding of the Mass is that the Mass provides nourishment for the priest in the absence of a communal celebration. Here we see another development into the canon itself from the teaching from the popes, that this is a devotion that one has, and this devotion allows for one to celebrate without the faithful being present. He continues on the next headline, In Concelebratione Missae 3 in Canon 902. The Council determined that a priest should be given access to either concelebrating the Mass or individual celebration. Canon 902 gives the priest individual celebration rights. A priest can choose between concelebration or individual celebration. Here in the article is where Vincent says that he will begin to present a legislation on the celebration of Mass in the absence of the faithful. He continues under the headline, The Formulation of Canon 906. The Reverend says that the, quote, just and reasonable cause, unquote, determines that it is not a serious concern for a priest to have a server during Mass. returning to John Hewell's accusation that the Mass cannot be celebrated alone because a priest's preference does not meet the reasonable and just cause from the canon. John Hewell defines a just and reasonable cause as, quote, whenever a member of the faithful is unavailable and when the priest is unable to participate in a communal celebration, e.g., as a result of illness, infirmity, or travel, end quote. Vincent Wu gives an example of an unjust and unreasonable cause for Mass without a congregation, quote, if a group of parishioners reasonably desires to have a daily Mass in the morning before heading to work, the priest may not deny this and celebrate Mass privately later in the day merely because he prefers not to rise early, end quote. Canon 904 seems to allow priests to celebrate the Mass without any present, since they are following the precept for a daily devotion. Yet, if a priest does not make sufficient effort to have the faithful present at his Mass, he will be celebrating illicitly, and even more so if he does so habitually. Others posit that a devotion to daily celebration is just cause for Mass without any present. Here's where I'm starting to take offense, because it seems to me that we have gotten rid of this social nature of the Mass, and we've removed and replaced it with this idea of the daily devotion, and that the daily devotion trumps the social nature of the Mass. It continues under the headline of Concelebration versus Individual Celebration with No Faithful Present. The way that one celebrates Mass influences the way one prays, since clearly there are differences between concelebration and individual recitation. Each will have their own manner of prayer associated. Since John Hewell contends that a priest's convenience does not constitute a reasonable cause, then the priest will be required to concelebrate instead of private celebration. Vincent Wu contends against John Hewell, saying that Canon 902 allows a priest to continue to... Vincent Wu contends against John Hewell, saying that Canon 902 allows a priest to choose to concelebrate. The canon does not impose an obligation to concelebrate. There was at one time a recommendation for concelebration, but it was never put in the canon. Sacrosanctum Concilium 57 intends for an increase in the possibility of concelebration, but not the restriction of individual recitation. I kind of agree with John Hewell. I like his take. This communal Mass should be upheld at all cost. And reading back from the Sacrosanctum Concilium paragraph, it seems as though this is what is promoted by the council, rather than having this desire for a quasi-private Mass. But let us continue. Oh, and let me state that all this writing in between the headlines is my own taking from the work. This is not a one-to-one representation of the work. While it is pretty low-level interpretation, I tried to stay rather true to what he was saying as I found his words agreeable and worthwhile. Alright, let me continue. The headline, the interplay among canons 902, 904, and 906. This is like the meat of his argument. His use of these three canons to push forth what he interprets to be correct. The Reverend Vincent Wu finds that Mass may be privately celebrated even when a concelebration is available. Canon 904 suggests daily Mass. The desire to offer daily Mass constitutes a just and reasonable cause required from Canon 906, and a priest may choose between concelebration or individual recitation from Canon 902. This is qualified also by a priest's devotion to the Holy Eucharist rather than pleasure or convenience, an effort to secure faithful for the Mass or a bishop's dispensation from Canon 906. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back down. Where were we? Alright, let me continue again. This is qualified also by a priest's devotion to the Holy Eucharist rather than pleasure or convenience, an effort to secure faithful for the Mass or a bishop's dispensation from Canon 906, and of course a priest cannot celebrate alone during another priest's concelebration. I keep saying concelebration, but I mean he cannot celebrate alone during another priest's celebration. He would have to concelebrate at that point.
it kind of all hinges on what you consider a just and reasonable cause. Do you agree with John Hewell that a priest's desire to celebrate on one's own is not a just and reasonable cause? Or do you listen to Vincent W, where he states that because of what the Pope has taught, the Council has kind of put forth in these other documents a devotion to the Holy Eucharist in its daily, in a commitment to sacrifice and say Mass daily is a reasonable and just cause. But I don't like how he takes it farther and uses it as a way of like saying you can opt for this daily quasi-private celebration. All right, let me continue. The practical applications of Canon 906 in relation to Canons 902 and 904. In large groups of priests, the norm has become concelebration, but the Council did not want that to be the case. While I agree, I do think that the Council wants priests to do what is right, but they also want the Mass to be as it is, a social endeavor, rather than this quasi-private thing. And to use these canons to really promote the quasi-private celebration, I think, is kind of going against what the Council wants. Even though you were in jest, my words are so poor, but you were following what the canons say, but I don't think that's what the history of the Church has done. I don't think that's what the Council stated. I mean, we read the quote from the Council earlier, and that's the one he provided in the article too, so it's not like I went out and found that myself. Oh well, let us continue. Large gatherings of priests. Because it is a norm for gatherings of priests to concelebrate, the right of a priest to individual recitation is not always respected. Organizers should be required to offer a way for priests to celebrate individually during the gathering of priests. The organizers only have to work with those priests who have a daily devotion to the Holy Eucharist by providing means for them to access the altar. Here's where I think he messed up. He should have mentioned right in this paragraph that the general instructions for the Roman Missal, suggests that priests, when they're gathered together, concelebrate. And I think by not mentioning that here, he does kind of a disservice to the argument. Priests who have no full care of souls. What options are available for those who have no one to attend their Mass? A priest must make effort to find others to attend his Mass. If it becomes habitual that no one is able to attend the priest's Mass, he should request a dispensation from the bishop. Not much for me to say there. Priests living a common life in diocesan seminaries. To teach seminarians the practice of concelebration, it is necessary for a priest within the seminary to concelebrate occasionally. This priest does have the right to individual celebration as stated in Canon 902. While the germ suggests community priests to concelebrate, the priest also is permissible to celebrate individually. A priest could celebrate in the morning, then in coro during the normal concelebration. The rector of the seminary may also assign seminarians to serve for priests celebrating individually. Vincent W makes a great statement saying, quote, "A seminary is intended to prepare men to be future pastors rather than religious who live in communities," end quote. I think this is a very strong paragraph. I think even with his mentioning of the germ, saying that when priests gather together, they should or are suggested to concelebrate, his idea of using in coro, which I don't really truly understand what it means, but I think it's like, you've already done your daily celebration individually, so now you're going and being almost like in the chorus or the choir with the rest of the people, as though you're a normal participant in the Mass. I think that's a very strong point. I also really like this end quote. A seminary is intended to prepare men to be future pastors rather than religious who live in communities. That is so true. The pastor isn't going to concelebrate every day. Rural pastors are only, it's just them. Like they're lone wolves out there doing what they have to do. They're not always going to concelebrate. So, it's a good point. He concludes with, Reverend Vincent W finds that it is all right if a priest chooses to celebrate Mass individually, even if no faithful can be present. There are, of course, caveats, but the Council has determined that daily Mass is very important for the spiritual health of each priest. Alright, I gathered my thoughts together earlier. Let me read them out and see if I have anything else I want to say or conclude from this article. I think it is important to follow the Council in all its teachings. I do not adhere to the dissidents' claims that the Second Vatican Council is a work of modernism and is therefore a development of Catholic teaching out of line with what historically has been done. Yet I struggle with this idea of private Mass being fine. It seems to me that a Mass without the faithful is inherently disordered because the Mass has always been considered a social and communal event. And let me add here and say that we read earlier the quote from Sacrosanctum Concilium, that it should not be a quasi-private event. Rev Vincent W, in his article on the Mass, with no faithful present, displays this history through the councils, synods, and popes, who have determined that private Mass is not to be done in an easy manner. With this being said, I think that Vatican II has increased the daily Mass in such a way that it inherently conflicts with the history of the refusal to admit private Mass. Here is where I must not have remembered the line from the Sacrosanctum Concilium. It doesn't seem as though that document wanted a quasi-private Mass, but the canons kind of promote that. The canons 902, 904, 906 can coherently be said to allow a priest to celebrate Mass when no faithful are present. I wish that the social nature of the Mass was given greater importance. Look at what Vincent said near the end of his article that, quote, a seminary is intended to prepare men to be future pastors rather than religious who live in communities, end quote. I agree. A priest is not a religious in a religious community of other priests, but he is the pastor of a religious parish. This community should be emphasized so that the priest does not feel little to no obligation to celebrate Mass in the community. I think the celebration of Mass privately does increase one's devotion to the Holy Eucharist, but if the cost is community for private devotion, it can be an abuse. I thought it was incredible how little time it took for the Church to go from such a severe restriction to the norm potentially being that priests celebrate this great and possibly the greatest social event privately. Do you remember how the Reverend Vincent detailed development from without a server? A Mass cannot be said to a Mass can be said with no faithful present and no server? So personally, this strikes me as disorder because the Church was so adamant for so long that the Mass is social. Yet Vatican II has emphasized the point that the Mass is a personal devotion and the spiritual food for the priest, which will provide benefit for the community he is a part of. I just hope that this does not harm the community of the faithful, and because it has such a striking difference to the history, it may easily be going in that direction. I think that what I want to understand more is why the Church found it so necessary to prevent the celebration of private Masses. What changed that the Church no longer considers the private celebration of Mass to be an abuse? Is it simply the Council's teaching that daily celebration of Mass is spiritually good for the priest, even in the solo? What is more important, the communal nature of the Mass or its spiritual gifts? Would the method in which priests now celebrate Mass have been considered an abuse by the early Church? These are all questions I really would enjoy discussing with someone else more developed in this thought. But yeah, overall I think the Reverend wrote a very coherent and worthwhile article that promotes and gives understanding to these three canons that allow for a priest to say Mass individually, and explains that the Church even promotes, maybe not promotes, but allows and says that each priest has a right to individual celebration. I kind of think that it's an abuse, though, to push for this quasi-private Mass when a celebration is available and you can't get faithful to attend your Mass, to then say you can do this Mass because of your devotion to the Holy Eucharist. I think that's an abuse. I think that's not in line with what was going on in the Church from the start all the way up to the Second Vatican Council, and that even the Vatican Council, the second one, doesn't really promote that view. And that these priests who are pushing more and more for this individual recitation of the Mass are promoting instead rather their devotion over social communion. So it's difficult there. This doesn't seem like it should be a norm. It seems like it should be something that is like a side case, something that is special, rather than the normal thing. So in a way, I agree with John Huell, but I also don't agree with the way John Huell was taking things, for how you're always supposed to concelebrate. Perhaps I'm misquoting him, but yeah, if a priest is given the right to choose to concelebrate, he should be able to choose to concelebrate, but it shouldn't be the normal. And if your concelebration is done alone with no server and no faithful, I don't know, buddy, it seems kind of bad. But yeah, tell me what you guys think if you have any quotes from this or any idea about it. See ya.